I bid you welcome.
I welcome you to my house.
Welcome to my house.
Welcome to my home.
Hello horror hounds, welcome to my horror house and welcome back to my Amityville Bookathon. We've already looked at the Amityville Horror by Jay Anson and their follow-ups by John G. Jones, the Amityville Horror Part 2 and Amityville the Final Chapter, telling the story of the Lutz family and their time in the house at 112 Ocean Avenue and their experiences after leaving the house. We're going to jump track now and also go back in time with Hans Holzer's book Murder in Amityville. He doesn't focus on the Lutzes at all, but instead is interested in the family that were in the house beforehand, the Defeos, and in particular the murder of 6 family members by the 7th, the eldest son, Ronald Defeo Jr. Holzer is a parapsychologist, so he's coming at the story from that angle, using, I guess, the fact of these murders coupled with the worldwide notoriety that the house attained after the Lutz story and the Amityville Horror, married with the testimony of Ronald Defeo Jr., where at times he said that he heard voices which told him to kill his family, to investigate the possibility that Ronald Defeo Jr. at the time of those crimes might have been possessed. What we do have is a fairly straightforward, no frills presentation of some things which are a matter of public record and transcripts of other parts of Holzer's own investigation. It starts with a foreword where, very interestingly, Holzer presents us with different definitions of what he means by possession. He's basically saying, look, I'm going to be saying possession a little bit later on, and this is what it means to different people. To people of a religious background, it means this. To people of a psychological background, it means this. To a scientific person, it might mean this. To me as a parapsychologist, this is what I mean by possession. And having now read the book, it also does feel like he's laying out his stall a little bit to say, look guys, possession's a bit of a movable feast and means different things to different people. So when I'm unable to reach an absolute definitive conclusion by the end of the book, just remember what I said at the start. Yes, I really like the way it's laid out. If I read you through the contents page, it will give you an idea of how the book is segmented. Chapter 1 is the facts of November 13th, 1974. So we get what we know about the crime and what happened. Chapter 2 is hearing before the trial, the official records, transcripts of the hearing. Chapter 3 is called Enter the Psychiatrist. So again, transcripts of interviews with the psychiatrists who have interviewed Ronald Defeo Jr., both from the prosecution and defense lawyers. Chapter 4 is a visit at Amityville in the dead of winter, which is a transcription of the conversation between him and the medium that he brought into the Amityville house to do their investigations there. Chapter 5, the investigation continues, more court transcripts. 6, which is really interesting, a visit with Ronald Defeo Jr. at Dannemora, which is a transcript of an interview between Holzer and the murderer himself, Ronald Defeo Jr. And as I mentioned earlier, Chapter 7, conclusions, which there really aren't any. I first read this book when I was really very young and much, much less critically savvy than I am now, and I was at that age very struck with the verisimilitude of the court records. I mean, they're public records. This is what is said, and this was what was said by whom at the time. What I'm struck by now, older and much more cynical, reading back through these, is sort of like, yeah, and they paint quite a good picture of what various people thought of Ronnie DeFeo Jr. They don't in any way go really towards bolstering up his argument that he might have been possessed. What I find really interesting is that he'll present those court transcripts, you know, the public record. This is them, and then side by side with them, this is a transcript of what the medium said when she went round the house with me that one winter's night, and they're both sort of presented side by side as if they both have equal bearing and each hold an equal amount of truth. But that's not the case. There's a very large hook that he hangs an awful lot of his argument on, which occurs during that visit to the house with the medium, where she comes up with this notion of the it's so cheesy, I almost don't want to say it, but this ancient Indian burial ground nonsense. She talks of a Native American chief who's buried on the grounds, not even on the ground where the house stood, and many years ago his body was disturbed and his skull was taken, and now he will curse and avenge himself on any white man who moves into the house. And this, for Holzer, is supposedly enough to wrap the entire rest of his investigation round. And I'm sorry, but it's really flimsy. To his credit, he includes in this interviews with people who completely counter his narrative. He speaks to someone at the end of the book from the Amityville Historical Society who says, no, that native tribe didn't live in this part of Long Island. It was a completely different tribe. So that information you've got there, we dispute it completely. He speaks to some of the lawyers who were involved in the case, some of the policemen who investigated the case, and they say, no, I don't think that there was anything paranormal going on here at all. Most damning of all, and most interesting of all, is the interview with Ronald Defeo Jr. himself, who is clearly a man who has changed his story about these murders time and time again. In his interview with Hans Holzer, in this book, he says, oh, the bit in my testimony where I said I heard voices, I said that because I wanted the psychiatrists to think I was insane. I didn't hear voices. And then later on within the same interview, Holzer has managed to talk him back round into saying, oh yeah, I was definitely under the influence of a force that was making me do something that I didn't want to do. Yeah, that kind of stuff happens all the time. Holzer asks him, have you ever had instances where you'll know something's going to happen before it happens? No, that's never happened. Nothing like that's ever. No, it's never happened. So you've never thought this and then something. Oh yeah, well, yeah, it happens quite a lot. He changes his story about 3 times within this interview. There's one really creepy moment in Ronnie DeFeo's testimony where he's talking about the events of that night, and bear in mind his story about that night changes like the fucking wind changes. It's a very striking image of him waking up in the TV room, and his eldest sister Dawn is there with a rifle, and she silently hands him the rifle, and he takes it and then proceeds to shoot his family. And he describes her hands as being blackened, with the suggestion being, was it really Dawn, or was it an entity in the house? And as a horror fan, I find that really creepy. I find the fact that 6 people could get shot with a bolt action rifle and no one wakes up really creepy. There are certainly some strange question marks hanging over this case, but 6 people were murdered. I find it very queasy that this and all of the Amityville entertainment industry, let's be honest, is built on the foundations of the murder of 6 people and the subsequent claims of the family that moved in afterwards. All this crazy ghost shit happened. So while there are undoubtedly 2 or 3 creepy things in here, my main takeaway from this book is that Ronald Defeo Jr. will never just straight up confess as to why he slaughtered his family on that night, and it's partly his refusal or inability to understand why that happened, which has continued to fuel the fascination with the house in Amityville, and which allowed the Lutzes to get away with what they got away with. If this had been an open and shut murder case, it would be a very sad and tragic family story from the 70s, and we all probably wouldn't have even heard about it. But no, he said he heard voices to try and be declared insane, and then after that the Lutzes said what they said. So my thoughts on a reread is not that Ronald Defeo Jr. was possessed, and to be fair, even Holzer in his conclusions kind of says it's not something I can prove. You know, if you think he did it or if you didn't think he did it. Let me see if I can find. So this is what he says in the end. If he was being used by forces beyond our physical world to do their bidding, then his own will was totally excluded from the action. In that case, incarceration for the rest of his life seemed out of proportion with the deed. In the final analysis, no one could punish Ronald Defeo Jr. any more than he has already done himself, having to live for the rest of his life with the knowledge that he had either willingly or unwillingly murdered 6 members of his own family seems punishment enough. No, it doesn't. That's not my takeaway from this book. Even with the interview with the man in the book, there doesn't really seem to be remorse coming off the pages in waves. What this book seems to be a testament to is the fact that here is a man who is either unable to or flat out refuses to tell the truth of what happened that night, and depending on who he is speaking to, will say pretty much whatever comes into his head that he thinks will help him. Hans Holzer returns twice more to the subject of Amityville in book form, and his next book, The Amityville Curse, is what we will talk about next.